With all the changes going on with the enhancement tree, you're probably wondering to yourself, is this even enhancement anymore? I know when I read the first passive notes, a chill went down my spine, and not because they removed all the frost stuff, and thought we might be in for another overreach sending us all the way back to BFA basics. But I'm here to tell you that at the very least, I was more than pleasantly surprised when I got to try it out. I don't think it's perfect by any stretch, and there's definitely quite a bit lost in the transition over to Midnight, but I don't think we've lost nearly as much as it looks like on paper because of how much needless bloat we've had tacked onto some things over the years. What we instead have is a more refined version of a very similar gameplay loop with some caveats. First, I'm going to cover the overarching gameplay loop and abilities that the spec shares between hero trees now. The core principles are similar between both of them, but they diverge at a few key points due to how their trees work now. After that, I'll be breaking down each hero talent and getting into the nitty-gritty of how they flow compared to live. I'm going to assume you've had a look at either the full patch notes linked in the description or my breakdown video covering the talents here, so I won't be explicitly going through how each talent works. I'll also have dummy logs for any of the combats shown on screen in the description below. Anyway, let's get started. First up to bat is our core abilities. The redesign now places a very heavy focus on Crash Lightning as a core ability, emphasized even further by our Apex talents. This is now a mixture between a direct damage strike and a maintenance buff, and Storm Unleashed reset procs are extremely valuable. Having this roll over to 2 or even 3 stacks makes each strike you can squeeze in all the stronger through the splash, which since it has no target requirement, is used on cooldown to maintain as much as possible. That it also still provides extra background Maelstrom weapon generation to each strike is an even better bonus. The only downside now is that the splash damage doesn't scale up at all in AoE. Storm Strike and Lava Lash are now more present in both trees, and a few key things have changed. With the removal of Legacy of the Frost Witch, we now rely far more on the new Elemental Tempo to fill out our GCDs. This places an emphasis on using Maelstrom Spender Weaving to make sure we can always fill our globals, and keeps that rewarding resource management component intact. With the change to Mastery making Storm Surge procs much less frequent, this also means Lava Lash is still used regularly even when you're playing Stormbringer. Storm Blast is also incredibly easy to reach on the tree, meaning that it serves as the most reliable backbone strike for Totemic as well. With Elemental Assault also only being 1 point now, and the addition of Lightning Strikes, they create an extremely good, reliable back and forth between build and spend without feeling like fillers. Ride the Lightning simply just adds on to make those strikes even better and convert to AoE completely for free. Voltaic Blaze is a combination GCD. It's both a really heavy hitter for both trees, but it's also a backup emergency generation tool if you don't think you'll meet a threshold coming up. Giving 3 stacks on demand when needed feels very good rotationally, but the only downside is right now it has no haste scaling, so it doesn't quite mesh with the other abilities regularly and it clashes a bit too often. The spender economy is similar but different. I'll get more into this in the Stormbringer and Totemic sections because they've both had their relationship with them changed, but the short and long of it is, generation is basically the same as live. The biggest worry I saw from people is that it looks like everything is slowing down, but not only is generation just as good as on live, partially due to the Crash Lightning effect happening in the background, it's actually a little more predictable, with long streaks of low gen being much less common, or at least it currently feels that way to me. And the cooldowns. Right now, the whole Doomwinds versus Ascendants versus DRE thing is a bit up in the air. The numbers and uptime between them are certainly not balanced, and Doomwinds versus Ascendants as effects is a bit confusing in detail. With the changes to Static Accumulation and Thorm's Invocation moving on to Doomwinds as well, it just kind of means avoiding the final node entirely and sticking to a 1-minute burst window might always just be the play. The infrequency of random Doomwinds/Ascendants procs, combined with them still being very powerful, as well as losing the reliable 1-minute cooldown, almost makes that capstone undesirable unless you really need longer 2-minute burst or want to be ranged for a bit. Right now, I just find the consistent 1-minute cycle of Doomwinds on its own is more than enough to feel like I have a lot of burst in the tank when I need it for either hero tree. Sundering now being the vector for splintered elements feels pretty good. Not having the target scaling component means it's just a 30-second power infusion for 2 talent points, which in my book is a pretty damn good mini cooldown to have. It also removes all the setup requirements for using Primordial Wave. So, how do these come together for the hero talents? Starting with Stormbringer, the problem child of the War Within that caused so many tuning issues every patch, both good and bad for us, it's no wonder that someone came in and had a look at it. So how did it fare? The 2 changes you'll notice immediately when playing is both Tempest and Rolling Thunder. Not having that momentum of building up dogs for accelerated burst is definitely a big hit to what made the spec work. And despite it being the main cause of it being so hard to balance, it was really fun, and I'm pretty sad to see it go. The flip side is, now that you're not beholden to how many Tempests you can vomit out in a tiny window, how desperate you are for Tempest procs all the time shrinks a bit, and instead, they're just procs of extra burst that can be deployed when you need them in AoE by just Chain Lightning instead, or just spikes in single target as you're using your rotation. Rolling Thunder, though, is just kind of bad now. Wolves don't have the kick that they used to at all, to the point where they're borderline cosmetic, and a swing in the other direction this hard on the talent is just kind of sad. It's still definitely the spender-heavy tree, and procs are actually more frequent than I expected without the fixed 40-stack goal, and generation gets cranked up a lot by Supercharge, Stormwell, and the extra haste from unlimited power still. That previously only AoE node that we had in Voltaic Surge has also now got real value all the time, since we use both Crash Lightning and Chain Lightning in single target via Ride the Lightning. Unfortunately, with new talents, Descending Skies pushing you toward Ascendant, but as lightly as possible with a single Tempest trigger every 2 minutes, or roughly one with DRE, seems really lackluster as the new big thing that we get. It still cranks out bursts during cooldowns, and now every minute if you just play Doomwinds, and the rapid-fire cycling of up to 10 stacks per strike from Thoriums can often mean a lot of Tempests condensed into a short window for a lot of just raw damage. Even getting blanketed by the Sundering Haste to speed it up more. This goes even further with extra Crash Lightning resets from Storm Unleashed, condensing reset power into a short, off-GCD go with almost no setup time at all. On top of that, it now also just has Voltaic Blaze as an on-demand burst Maelstrom gen tool if you're really desperate to power up the Tempest you have in the tank right now. Moving on to the eternal roller coaster that is Totemic design, I'm pleased to report that it's crawled out of the hole that it fell into in Season 3. Some of its absolute biggest flaws have been directly addressed on the hero tree, and you just love to see it. That said, it's still got a totem, so if that's not your thing, then bad news. Surging Totem being moved away from a maintenance cooldown and instead into a 1-minute tool has led to it having a fair bit more power put into each drop. In particular, the Earth Mote now doubling the damage of Sundering means the upfront damage you can trigger is pretty extreme through Whirling Elements, Surge Catalyst, and Reactivity. Triggering your Mote with a Spender, then using Sundering, triggering Hot Hand window, and then using Doomwinds off GCD to extend it even further with Totemic Momentum can give some really long duration windows. By extension, all of these strikes being used to trigger Ride the Lightning and Thorium's Invocation at the same time means that Totemic Rebound can get stacked very quickly, and the totem often tails off fully ramped up. Speaking of Totemic Momentum, this talent almost on its own fixes Totemic's relationship with spenders. First though, Hot Hand. This change blocking triggers while it's active does mean procs are less frequent, and the need to extend them with momentum feels quite important. The CDR while active also means there's no longer the fixed 1-2-1-2 weaving cycle, RIP my muscle memory, and instead we leverage spenders to extend both Hot Hand to make room for more lashes, and Elemental Tempo CDR to bring it back in line, meaning that a spend, Lava Lash, in particularly during our Doomwinds window, is still possible to do. This gives a lot more texture to those windows, and even adds in skill expression that wasn't there before these changes were put in. I think, in general, there's a lot less about what's been done to Totemic that feels like something was directly lost. A lot of its tools were fun in concept, and most of the time were fun to execute, but there was unnecessary friction in the way in so many of them. GCD clashes with Totem setup, Wolves, Primordial Wave, Doomwinds, everything about optimizing Totemic Recall, and priorities between Hot Hand and Molten Thunder procs, all while not having much of a reason to spend outside your moats and the old Elemental Blast cooldown, kind of made for a bit of a confusing and bloated gameplay loop unless you did all the research behind it. What these changes feel like they've done is re-inject actual core classic enhancement gameplay that we've had over the years, in between the previously dominant Totemic loop that they put in the War Within, and it feels like it has a good reason to exist. I also just like Surging Totem being moved to a burst cooldown than a pet rock I need to lug around everywhere too, alongside the tree still lining up with that good 30-second/1 minute timer, and it even has the potential of Oversurge having a purpose again, though that kind of relies on them getting the whole Ascendance and Doomwinds balance right, which they haven't right now. I think the entire spec feels like it's in a really good place overall when it comes to flow. There's a lot less redundant resets that feel like you're flooded, and far less times where you're grasping for air for something to press. I put a lot of this on Elemental Tempo, which I think is excellent design, and the balancing out of Maelstrom weapon gen, consolidating the rotational buttons down to 4 abilities in Storm Strike, Lava Lash, Crash Lightning, and Voltaic Blaze, I think both works a lot better than I expected, and is far clearer in what each button is there to do in the rotation. I can feel out most of our rotation now while playing Alpha, without relying on sims or log crawling straight out the gate, which is something that I definitely couldn't say for quite a few versions in the past. I am, however, quite aware that a lot of this comes across as glowing praise in a time when people are very skeptical about the changes happening across the game, and there's not a lot of people who've been trying the spec out. So I'm going to try and temper it with at least one half of a compliment sandwich at the end. First, before anything else, the UI support is bad right now. Having no resource tracking for Maelstrom weapon and instead relying on a single buff icon with stacks is not workable, at least for me personally. I'm not about to wade into the whole add-on discourse in public right now because I love the way that I have my UI set up on live, but damn, it needs to be better than this if the spec is going to feel right to play when it hits a live environment for most people. With talents, losing wolves as a relevant part of the spec sucks. They've been with my shaman since Wrath of the Lich King, and while they've had ups and downs, the sheer number of nerfs they took in this iteration feels like it might have gone just a bit too far. That they've gone from a mainstay to a talent that right now doesn't even come into the equation versus others as a single point is a pretty sad thing to see. While my personal priority is rotation and combat flow above all else, I do think it's a bit sad to see the whole Fire, Frost, Nature thing go with the effective deletion of anything related to Frost and Elemental Blast. I know why they did it, because all of the confusion that it caused and spreading things too thin got a bit far, but that is still a bit of the identity loss that we've had in the past. That said, what's being done here is a pretty damn good iteration of various historic enhancement effects over the years, and they do really marry well together. While I'll be going into the non-DPS things we lost in another video, hopefully, I can't sideline how much I'm worried about our defensive toolkit. Losing Stone Bulwark Totem and instead now relying on Earth Elemental, which is often a bit suicidal during Mythic Plus trash, is worrying. Losing so much CC as well is going to hurt, and while it wasn't necessarily good to have so much brought by one spec and class, it's definitely going to be noticeable when you step into Mythic Plus. Anyway, that's the broad strokes of what my impressions are and what our gameplay looks like going into Midnight so far. I think this redesign has been in the oven for quite a long time and is pretty polished compared to almost every other alpha build that I've experienced as enhancement. I'm cautiously optimistic about the direction, and I'd probably give it at least an 8 out of 10. We'll see how the defensive and utility things shake out across classes though, since I'm very skeptical there. And how this translates to endgame and more serious content though, we'll see as alpha settles down a bit. It's a bit too early to tell, and we need to look at all classes holistically before you can really gauge that. Ideally, I'll have a couple of dungeon runs on the way to go with this, so you can see more gameplay in action, and maybe a rundown of some feedback and things to look at as well as the alpha keeps going. Lastly, you can find logs of the combat that was on screen in the description below, so you can go and analyze them and make fun of my old man gameplay in the comments.